The year was 1945, and the world was on the edge of change. The war had ended in Europe, but for the prisoners held at Fort Deans, Massachusetts, that change felt like a distant hope. The group of German women, captured as the last vestiges of the Reich crumbled, had no idea what lay ahead for them. Their bodies were tired, their spirits broken, but they were alive. Among them was Elizabeth, a young woman of 23, whose face still held the remnants of the girl she once was. Her uniform, tattered and stained, bore the insignia of the Volkssturm, a desperate final defense force cobbled together in the last months of the war. She had joined the war effort out of a sense of duty, believing in the ideals of the fatherland. But standing now in an American prison camp, her resolve was shaken. Everything she had once believed in was being questioned. The women were lined up for their first meal in the camp. The guards were young men, some barely older than Elizabeth, and the tension was palpable. The camp was colder than she had expected. The barren walls, the rough wood of the tables, and the sparse food, it was nothing like what she had imagined America to be. But that first meal would be one she would never forget. One of the American soldiers approached them, a young man named Private Thomas, holding a large tray with strange glasses filled with thick, creamy liquid. "Chocolate milkshakes," he said with a shy grin. "You might want to try one. It's real." The word milkshake sounded foreign, almost like a joke. Elizabeth exchanged a glance with her fellow prisoners. None of them had ever heard of such a thing. They were all unsure how to react. To them, it felt like another trick, another strange custom from the enemy. But when the glass was handed to her, Elizabeth hesitated, then took a tentative sip. The taste hit her like a wave, a mix of sweetness, richness, and a strange comfort. It was unlike anything she had ever tasted. Her eyes widened in surprise, her lips still tingling from the strange, frothy drink. She looked around at the other women, some of whom had taken cautious sips as well. The room was filled with a quiet buzz, an undercurrent of disbelief. "I thought we were dreaming," Anna, a fellow prisoner, whispered from across the table, her own glass shaking slightly in her hands. Elizabeth didn't answer at first. She couldn't. What did it mean that something so simple, something so American, could taste like home? For a moment, the bitterness of captivity faded. The warmth of the drink was a reminder that despite everything, despite the war, despite the years of conflict, they were still human. They still felt joy, even in this dark place. As Elizabeth sat there, her mind raced. How could this be real? How could this milkshake, this simple gift, make her feel more at ease than anything in the past few months? For the first time since her capture, Elizabeth felt something unfamiliar, a spark of hope. Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the snow fall gently outside. The camp was quiet, the stillness broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway. Inside, the women kept to themselves, each of them lost in her own thoughts. It was a strange silence, one that felt heavier than the weight of the war itself. As she stared out into the gray sky, Elizabeth's mind drifted back to the years before her capture. She had been just a girl when the war began, only 16, full of youthful idealism and a sense of duty to her country. She had joined the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, convinced that her role was to protect the homeland. The thought of serving her country, of contributing to the Reich's defense, had felt noble at the time. She had believed in the cause, in the power of her nation to overcome the enemies surrounding it. But the war had been unforgiving. Elizabeth had seen the horrors, both on the front lines and in the cities where families lived in constant fear. She had watched as the dream of a proud Germany turned to rubble. The weight of her own actions, the people she had helped harm, those thoughts crept into her mind at night, refusing to let her sleep. The propaganda she had once believed in seemed hollow now, empty words that did nothing to justify the suffering that had unfolded before her eyes. Elizabeth wasn't the only one struggling. The other women in the camp, each with their own stories, shared a similar weight. Anna, the young nurse from Berlin, had once cared for wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital. She had joined the war effort thinking it would end quickly, that her work would help save lives. Instead, she was left questioning everything she had once believed in. Like Elizabeth, Anna found herself questioning the very ideals that had shaped her young adulthood. The days spent at the camp felt like an eternity. The women followed the routine mechanically, going through the motions, their faces stoic, hiding the turbulence inside. But it wasn't just the memories of the war that weighed on them. It was the fear of what awaited them outside the camp. What would happen when they were released? Would they return to the homes they once knew? Or would they face a world that no longer recognized them? Elizabeth had heard the rumors how the Germans were suffering, how the cities were in ruins. She had no family left to return to, and the thought of returning to a destroyed homeland filled her with dread. What would it mean to go back to a country that no longer resembled the place she had fought for? Could she ever reconcile what she had done with the woman she was becoming? The question haunted her. Could she truly return to a life built on a foundation of lies and hatred? Or would she be forced to start anew in a world where nothing made sense anymore? As the days wore on, Elizabeth found herself asking another question. Who was she now? The girl who had joined the war was long gone. The woman who had come into this camp was someone who had seen the darkness, and perhaps, in this strange land, she could find the light. It had been several weeks since the strange encounter with the chocolate milkshake, and Elizabeth and the other women had settled into a strange routine. They still didn't fully understand the dynamics of the camp, but there were small moments that helped ease the tension. The American guards, young men like Private Thomas, who had offered them the milkshakes, seemed more human than the enemy they had been taught to hate. Elizabeth noticed the subtle acts of kindness when a guard would share a smile, or when one of the soldiers would pass by, making eye contact instead of looking away. These small moments, once unheard of during the war, were slowly breaking down the walls between the captors and the captives. Elizabeth couldn't explain it, but something inside her began to shift. One cold afternoon, Elizabeth was sitting on a bench near the mess hall, watching the others speak quietly among themselves. The sound of footsteps approached, and she looked up to see Private Thomas standing in front of her, his face more serious than usual. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he offered her a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, his voice gentle. Elizabeth stared at the bread, then up at him. For a moment, she couldn't speak. It was the first time one of the American soldiers had offered her something without orders. The gesture seemed so simple, yet it held so much meaning. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice catching in her throat. She accepted the bread, her hands trembling slightly. Thomas smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, leaving her to her thoughts. Elizabeth sat there, staring at the bread in her hands. It wasn't just the food that touched her. It was the fact that someone, an enemy soldier, had seen her as a person and not just as a prisoner. It was the first time in weeks that she felt anything resembling humanity from the outside world. That evening, as the women gathered for their meal, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the small kindnesses they had received over the past few weeks. The guards weren't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but these small acts were beginning to change how the women viewed their captors. They were no longer just soldiers. They were individuals, each with their own struggles, each carrying the weight of the war. Elizabeth's thoughts drifted to Sergeant Walker, who had been teaching them English. His lessons were becoming more personal as they shared stories and experiences, learning more about each other's lives. He wasn't just a teacher, he was becoming a friend. Elizabeth found herself speaking more often, her English improving, and in those moments she felt a connection to him that went beyond language. As the days passed, Elizabeth realized that the line between enemy and ally was no longer as clear-cut as it had once seemed. The men in this camp, once faceless adversaries, were now becoming people she could relate to. And for the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps she wasn't alone in this world after all. Elizabeth had never been particularly good at languages. Back in Germany, she had studied French in school, but it had never been a passion. Now, here in the American camp, learning English was becoming a necessity. The women were encouraged to take lessons, and although Elizabeth was hesitant at first, she found herself drawn to the lessons Sergeant Walker held each evening. The lessons were simple at first, basic words and phrases, greetings, and introductions. But as time passed, the lessons grew deeper. Elizabeth discovered that she had an aptitude for languages, a skill she hadn't realized she possessed. The words that once felt foreign and meaningless slowly began to make sense. She felt a sense of accomplishment with every new word she mastered, and it gave her something to focus on beyond the uncertainty of the camp. Sergeant Walker was patient with them, always encouraging them to speak and practice. He seemed genuinely interested in their progress, and over time, Elizabeth began to look forward to the lessons. What started as a simple exchange of words began to feel more personal. They began to share stories about their lives, their families, and their hopes for the future. Elizabeth had grown used to the cold, rigid walls between herself and others, but here, in these lessons, she began to see something different in the faces of the soldiers. They weren't the ruthless enemies she had been taught to fear. They were people. One evening, as they sat together around a small table in the camp's makeshift classroom, Sergeant Walker asked them to introduce themselves in English. Elizabeth was the first to speak. "My name is Elizabeth," she said carefully, her accent thick but clear. "I come from Hamburg. I was a secretary." The other women took their turns, speaking haltingly but with pride. It wasn't easy. Many of them stumbled over their words, their voices shaking with nervousness. But as they spoke, Elizabeth noticed something shifting within herself. She wasn't just speaking to these soldiers as a prisoner. She was speaking as a person, as someone trying to rebuild her life in a world that had been torn apart. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth's confidence grew. She began to participate more, asking questions and speaking more freely. It wasn't just about learning English, it was about connecting with the world around her in a way she hadn't thought possible. And the more she spoke, the more she realized that the language of kindness, whether through a simple word, a shared meal, or a friendly gesture, was the key to understanding each other. One evening, after class had ended, Sergeant Walker stayed behind to speak with Elizabeth. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet respect. "You're doing well," he said softly. "Keep at it. You're more than just a prisoner. You're a person." For the first time in months, Elizabeth felt seen not as an enemy soldier, but as an individual. The Christmas decorations were simple, handmade paper chains and wreaths from scraps of material, but they brought a sense of festivity to the otherwise cold and sterile camp. The women worked together, a little more cheerful than usual, hanging their decorations on the walls. It was the first holiday they had spent away from home, and the melancholy was palpable. But amidst the sadness, there was an unexpected opportunity. The Americans were offering a Christmas celebration for the prisoners. Elizabeth had never expected a holiday celebration in a prison camp, but that night she found herself in the camp's small communal hall, surrounded by the other women, a strange mixture of emotions stirring within her. For a moment, she had forgotten the horrors of the war, the long months of captivity, and the uncertainty of the future. It was a fleeting moment of normalcy, like a window into a life that was no longer hers. Private Thomas stood in front of the group with a grin on his face, holding something in his hands. "Tonight, you get something special," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "Chocolate milkshakes. They're a Christmas tradition here." The words chocolate milkshake hung in the air like a strange and wonderful promise. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a spark of anticipation. It had been weeks since that first strange encounter with the milkshake, and now the thought of having another seemed almost impossible. She couldn't remember the last time she had tasted something so sweet and comforting. The milkshakes were handed out, and Elizabeth took the glass with trembling hands. She had barely taken a sip before she closed her eyes, savoring the familiar taste. It was just as good as she remembered, thick and rich, with a sweetness that felt like a rare luxury in this place. For a moment, she forgot where she was, who she was. It was a taste of something better, something more innocent, that seemed to melt the hard edges of the war. Anna, sitting next to her, let out a soft laugh. "I thought I was dreaming the first time," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "And now, this." Elizabeth smiled, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. It was almost absurd to think that something so simple, something so American, could offer a moment of peace in the midst of so much chaos. She thought back to the life she had left behind, her family, her home, the country she once believed in, and felt a pang of longing. But as she sat there, surrounded by the women, she felt something else as well, a sense of connection, of shared humanity, despite everything that had come before. The milkshake was more than just a treat. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, kindness and small acts of generosity could still shine through. For the first time in a long while, Elizabeth felt hope not in the future, but in the present. Here, in this moment, she wasn't a prisoner. She was just a person, sitting with others, sharing a drink, and finding warmth in the unlikeliest of places. The days stretched on in a blur of routine. The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the camp in a quiet stillness. Elizabeth spent her time with the other women, learning English, working, and helping with small tasks around the camp. Despite the monotony, there was an unspoken understanding between the women. They no longer saw themselves solely as prisoners. They were surviving. They were adapting. But the war was never far from their minds. Even though the fighting had stopped, the pain and loss lingered. News from Germany, filtered through the occasional letter or a short radio broadcast, painted a picture of destruction. Cities reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and a country in ruin. Elizabeth read the newspapers in disbelief, unable to comprehend the devastation. What remained of her home? What would she return to? One evening, as the women sat together in the common room, Anna broke the silence. "Have any of you heard from your families?" she asked quietly, her voice strained. Elizabeth glanced up from the newspaper she had been reading. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Anna's face was pale, her eyes searching the room for some sign of hope. But no one answered. No one had heard from their families in months, if not years. Elizabeth clenched her fists in her lap. The letters she had sent home had returned unanswered. She had no idea what had happened to her parents or her younger brother. The fear gnawed at her every day, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to let it consume her. In the water's silence that followed, the women sat together, the sounds of their breathing the only noise. It was a strange kind of bonding. No words were needed. They all knew the pain they shared. Elizabeth thought about her home in Hamburg, the streets she had walked, the house where she had grown up. Could it still be there? Was there anyone left? Private Thomas appeared in the doorway, interrupting the quiet. His expression was somber. "There's news," he said, his voice low. "About the war. And Germany." The women looked up, their hearts pounding in their chests. Thomas stepped inside, holding a stack of newspapers. "There's been more bombings. Your cities, most of them are gone." The room seemed to close in on Elizabeth. Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She forced herself to stay calm, but inside, her world was crumbling. The home she had known was no longer there. The country she had fought for was reduced to ashes. "Is there anything left?" Maria, another prisoner, asked, her voice trembling. Thomas shook his head, his eyes full of regret. "I'm sorry. I don't have any more details." As the women sat there in stunned silence, Elizabeth's mind raced. The war was over, but the real war within her was just beginning. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a survivor, forced to face the truth of what had happened, not just to her country, but to herself. Elizabeth sat alone in the corner of the barracks, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The news about Germany had hit her harder than she had expected. The country she had once believed in, the place she had sworn to defend, was gone, reduced to ruins. Her mind swirled with thoughts of her family. Were they still alive? Were they caught in the bombings? The questions gnawed at her, but she forced them aside. There was nothing she could do now. She couldn't return to a homeland that no longer existed. But the thought of staying in the United States, or of remaining here, was equally terrifying. How could she live in a country that had once been her enemy? Would she ever truly belong here? The other women in the camp were grappling with similar questions. Some had heard from their families, others hadn't. Some had lost everything, while others still clung to the hope that their loved ones might be alive. Elizabeth had never felt so alone. The war had torn everything apart: her country, her family, and her sense of self. The question of what to do next loomed over her like a dark cloud. Anna, who had been one of her closest friends in the camp, sat beside her one evening, her eyes filled with concern. "What are you going to do, Elizabeth?" she asked softly. "The war is over. We have to face what comes next." Elizabeth didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The choice was too overwhelming. To go back to Germany would mean facing the destruction, the loss, and the guilt of being part of the machine that had caused so much suffering. But to stay in America? That would mean leaving behind everything she had ever known. She had no family here, no connection to this land. It would be like starting over from nothing. "I don't know," Elizabeth replied quietly. "I don't know if I can go back, but I don't know if I can stay here either." Anna nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I understand, I feel the same, but we have to make a choice. We can't keep running from what happened." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting. What did it mean to be free? Was freedom simply the absence of chains, or was it something more, something that had to be earned through choice and action? Her mind wandered back to the moments when the American soldiers had shown her kindness, when Private Thomas had shared that simple meal with her, when Sergeant Walker had offered her respect. Could she stay in a place where she had been treated with humanity, where she had been allowed to rebuild herself? The decision weighed heavily on her, but the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She couldn't return to Germany, not in the state it was in. She had to remain in the United States, to build a new life, to honor the humanity she had found here. "I think I want to stay," Elizabeth whispered, more to herself than to Anna. "I have to. I can't go back to what was." Anna didn't respond, but the quiet understanding between them was enough. The choice had been made. Elizabeth woke early the next morning, the cold of the barracks seeping into her bones. The camp was still, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallways. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the world in a blanket of white. But inside, the weight of her decision was heavy. She had made her choice to stay in America, to try and build a new life, but the fear that accompanied it was overwhelming. What would the future hold? The idea of freedom felt like a distant dream. It wasn't just the fear of leaving behind her past, her family, her country. It was the fear of the unknown. Elizabeth had been a soldier, a prisoner, and now she was being asked to become something entirely different. An immigrant, a woman without a homeland, without a defined place in the world. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. The morning's announcement broke her reverie. Captain Walker, the officer in charge of the camp, stood at the front of the room, addressing the gathered prisoners. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension in his words. "The war is over," he said, "but the decision of what happens next is yours. If you wish to return to Germany, you may. If you choose to remain here, we'll do everything we can to help you transition, but the path ahead is uncertain for everyone." Elizabeth listened, her mind racing. There it was, the choice she had made, and yet it still seemed impossible. How could she be free in a country that had once been her enemy? Could she really build a new life here, or was she fooling herself into thinking that freedom could be found in a place so foreign to her? As Captain Walker finished speaking, the room fell silent. The women exchanged uneasy glances, each of them facing a future they could not predict. The uncertainty was suffocating, and for the first time since her arrival, Elizabeth felt the true weight of the freedom she had chosen. Later that day, as Elizabeth sat alone by the window, she watched the snowflakes fall in slow, delicate patterns. It was beautiful, almost serene, but she couldn't shake the feeling of fear deep in her chest. She had been part of the war. She had been on the side of destruction. How could she be free from that? How could she be anything more than a soldier who had lost her way? But then she remembered something. The milkshake. The kindness from the American soldiers. The lessons from Sergeant Walker. They hadn't seen her as an enemy. They had seen her as a person, someone who could change, someone who could be more than her past. With a deep breath, Elizabeth made a quiet promise to herself. She would take this chance. She would face the fear of freedom and try to build a life. She would not let the war define her future. The decision had been made, and now the waiting began. Elizabeth, along with the other women who had chosen to stay, had made the difficult choice to remain in the United States. The authorities had agreed to reclassify them as displaced persons, but the process was slow. The women were no longer prisoners of war, but their futures were still uncertain. They had been given a chance at something new, but that did not make it any less frightening. The days became a blur of paperwork, interviews, and meetings with various officials. The women were asked questions about their pasts, their families, and their intentions. Some were eager to start over, others hesitant, still haunted by the past. Elizabeth found herself caught somewhere in between, unsure of where she truly belonged. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was sitting in a small office filling out forms, Private Thomas entered the room. His usual friendly demeanor was tempered by the seriousness of the situation. "How are you doing?" he asked softly, sitting across from her. Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "I'm managing," she replied. "But everything is still so uncertain. I'm not sure what's next." Thomas nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I can't imagine how hard this must be. But you're not alone, you know. You've made it this far." Elizabeth felt a lump rise in her throat. "I never thought I'd be here," she said, her voice faltering. "I never thought I'd be a prisoner of war, and now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be." Thomas leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're more than your past. You've shown courage just by being here. Not everyone would have chosen to stay. You've chosen to be part of something better, something beyond the war." His words, though simple, carried weight. Elizabeth hadn't thought about it that way. She had been so focused on the fear and uncertainty of her decision that she had forgotten about the courage it took to make it. She had chosen to face the future, even if she didn't know what it held. The following weeks were filled with small victories. Elizabeth's English improved, and she started to feel more comfortable in the camp. She began helping with translation and other duties, offering what little she could to contribute to the American effort. She wasn't a soldier anymore, but she was still part of something. One evening, as the women gathered together in the common room, Captain Sullivan addressed them. "You've all chosen to remain here, and I want you to know that your decision means a lot to us. You are no longer prisoners, but you're also not forgotten. We will help you start anew." There was a quiet murmur of relief among the women. Elizabeth glanced around the room, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. They had made it this far. They had chosen redemption, and now they would begin to rebuild. The years passed quickly, though to Elizabeth, each day felt like its own small victory. She had arrived in America a prisoner, but now, standing on the edge of her new life, she felt the weight of the choices she had made. Her life was no longer defined by her past actions or the war that had torn her world apart. She was free. She was a woman with a future. It wasn't easy. The transition from a prisoner to an immigrant was fraught with challenges. There were language barriers, cultural differences, and the ever-present fear that she would never truly belong. But Elizabeth threw herself into the work. She found a job as a translator for a local family, helping them with their paperwork and assisting in communications with displaced persons. Every day, she grew more comfortable in her new role. Anna, too, had found a new path. She had pursued her nursing certification and was now working at a local hospital. Elizabeth often saw her in the town, walking with purpose, her face more relaxed than it had been during their time in captivity. They both carried the same burden, the weight of their pasts, but in different ways. As for the other women in the camp, they, too, had started new lives. Some had married American soldiers, others had found jobs in various fields. There was a small community of former prisoners who had made their homes here in the United States, and each one of them carried a story of transformation. But Elizabeth's story, more than any other, was one of reconciliation. She had come to America to escape the remnants of her past, but she had found something far more powerful: the opportunity to be something different. The kindness she had encountered in this foreign land had allowed her to shed the layers of guilt and shame she had carried for so long. One afternoon, Elizabeth stood before a gathering at the United Nations in New York. She was invited to speak about her journey from a soldier in the German Women's Auxiliary Corps to an American citizen. She held the same leather diary she had carried with her since the day she first arrived at Fort Deans. She spoke about the power of forgiveness, the possibility of transformation, and the human capacity for redemption. Her words echoed in the hall, a message of hope and reconciliation. "We discovered," she said, her voice steady, "that home isn't just where you come from. It's where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature." As she spoke, Elizabeth felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. She had found her new home, not just in America, but in the woman she had become. The girl who had once fought for a country built on hatred had transformed into a woman who believed in the possibility of peace. And as the room erupted in applause, Elizabeth knew that the most powerful victory was not over the enemy, but over herself.